very honored and happy to be here in front of you today in Kaliningrad, where we will start to immerse ourselves into the complex topic of Kantian philosophy of enthusiasm and history. It might seem peripheral to main concerns of Kant's philosophy, the famous distinctions of a priori and a posteriori, the empirical and the pure, his effort to develop a comprehensive theory of human cognition and morality. But as we'll see time and again, the topics of enthusiasm and history cut across Kant's philosophy, reaching the depth and bringing out the basic tensions that underlie his thought. Take enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is a complex idea that might seem even contradictory within the context of Kant's, maybe life world or philosophical project, worldview, because he's a famous philosopher of rationalism, of reason, on the one hand. On the other hand, enthusiasm is an emotion, and this emotion is supposedly, its function is to connect the emotive side of humanity to the heights of the most abstract ideas that guide our path through, the next thing, history. And history is a problem because Kant is also famous for his attempt to uncover the universal, the permanent, the unchangeable in human thought, and also as he's famous for bringing the object into the constructive forces of the subject, so that the world is also subject to human regularities, human cognition. So again, history problematizes this hope of Kant that there is something universal, unchangeable, this transcendental structure that underlies all of human thinking, regardless of cultural belonging or thrownness into a historical period of time. With the historicist turn of the 20th century, we see that this Kant's hope has become a problem. And again, we see two big parties clashing in contemporary philosophy. The universalists who try to reveal something permanent, whether be it in the domain of neuroscience, basic biological, even chemical or physical, fundamentally laws that facilitate our cognition and are the same for all human beings, or in the domain of mathematics and logic, formalism, where again there is a hope of striking the universal gold. And the other side is deeply historicist, where in the Heraclitean movement there is nothing permanent, and what we take to be permanent today will be relativized tomorrow, and so on. So these two seemingly peripheral ideas of Kant allow us to take a deep look into the heart of his philosophical system and philosophical project. And my task, as I understand it, will be providing some, beating around the bush being the Kant's ideas, which we will be covering on our seminars. Our task is to read Kant and discuss his ideas. And my task is to provide appetizers or maybe some food for starters for our daily meetings that you could utilize to better understand Kant's intentions and your intentions and hopes and view of history and enthusiasm. Because, why would we turn ourselves to Kant? The final and the end is to understand and develop ourselves. So that's our basic goal. And today, so my today's beating around the bush will be mostly methodological. I will try to look not into enthusiasm or history or Kantian. This will leave for the later sessions, but mostly talk about the last word in this the title of our summer school, about the perspectives that we can utilize to comprehend Kant's ideas. And the main thesis is that there are many perspectives. We live in a multi-perspectival world, and we all occupy points of view. We have different horizons, and we can go on with the words of perspectival vocabulary that allow us to take a unique, ultimately, view of Kant's project, but also understand each other because we have the same object in our view. So perspective it is. I will begin by covering, well, maybe familiar, certainly familiar to some extent, methodological grounds on how we try to approach texts on the philosophy of history. So the talk will be not only or mostly not about Kant's methods of research. I will say a few words about his approach to philosophy of history, but I'll leave it for our Kant text sessions. But mostly I will talk about some contemporary approaches to understanding philosophies of histories. To start with Kant's ideas, two or methods of comprehending history. Two things come to mind. First is his careful and provisional approach. He constantly uses the phrase as if, als ob, when he's speaking about history. Because the reason being that history is a subject where the task of revealing universal laws of nature or something that is lurking behind nature. Kant is ambivalent with his understanding of nature in the context of history, and that's the second thing. So he's very careful in not advancing decisive theories. He's guessing. He's using abduction, a contemporary logician would say, or epistemologist. He's looking for a best explanation of the phenomena. And the unique thing about history is that the explanation has to be about all phenomena. Because history, in Kant's view, is a collection of facts or appearances. The manifold of all appearances, unfolding in the eyes and in the minds of all of human beings collectively. So, and perhaps not only human beings. Kant was explicit about his belief that it is likely that there are other reasonable human beings besides humans, reasonable beings, non-human beings. So anything that happens is a part of history. But the task of the philosophy of history is to discern the most general laws or regularities of this development of facts, starting from the emergence of matter. And we see this attempt in Kant's early works of the universal natural history, where he's starting his philosophy of history from setting Newton's system in motion, with the question of how this Newtonian system came about, due to what forces. So he's trying to go beyond the physics of the day and calls it a history. We'll look into that specifically later. And the second thing, as I mentioned, about Kant's approach to history, his method of studying history, is his ambivalence towards the notion of nature. Again, it's the area, the philosophy of history, where Kant is Seemingly, he abandons his naturalistic position regarding experience, because in his writings on history, nature oscillates between two meanings. First is the multitude of all things under the multitude of laws, the definition that we're used to throughout the corpus of his critical texts, from the first critique to the opus posthumum. And the other is seemingly a theological notion of nature with the capital N. Well, in German they're all with capital N, but in Russian they're not. So when you read Kant's musings or a hypothesis about nature in the context of history, you cannot help but make the N a capital letter, because nature seemingly has intentions or plans or purposes for the humanity, for the development of humanity. And these two aspects permit all of Kant's thought about history. But I will leave Kant for now and try to walk you through a set of contemporary methods of reading Kant. And for this, I'll need this simple scheme. When we approach any philosophy, and perhaps on even any text, I'll be careful about any text, but any philosophical text, we start with the letter and the word. So the top circle, where the word text stands, is our main object and starting point. It's obviously, the first step is to study the primary sources. We will do that. We'll study Kant's texts, and not only them, in the seminars. At the first glance, they produce or represent a reliable guide. The written and fixed expression of Kant's thought. They are the a priori, they are unchangeable and universal. Once written, they are here. And we may take this, their stability for granted, but this is there is a catch to it. We should be careful. So, of course, Kant's words and his text cannot be treated for granted in the same way as biblical texts once used to be treated or attempted to be treated. Or Marxism-Leninism tried to treat the canon of the 2 or 3 with Engels writers literally, and develop sophisticated hermeneutics to explicate and utilize the thought of the classics. This is not the way to do it. It has been discredited once and hopefully for all. There is no absolute knowledge coming from the transcendental source with fixed ahistorical meaning, because any text has a context, and I will turn to that in a moment. But there is a second step which we need to take when we, and we do take, especially when we deal with Kant. It is extracting a conceptual system from a text or a set of texts. And indeed, this is precisely what Kant is trying to do. He's trying to pack a conceptual system into a text, and our task is similarly to unpack it and then again utilize it. And of course, Kant's hope was that his conceptual system is the one. He is describing or has described the functioning of the human subject or transcendental subject, any reasonable being. And the task of people like us, the readers, perhaps the continuers of Kant's project, is to develop the details within the clear and complete outline. And we see the elder Kant clashing with people like Fichte and other less famous continuers for not developing the project further, but starting their own project instead. So again, there is a ambivalence or dialectic to that. On the one hand, indeed, it is necessary to try to and extract a conceptual system out of Kant's texts, and including those on history, philosophy of history. But this task has also time and again proven impossible, well, proven to be a regulative idea in Kant's terms. Something that we try to do, but something that we at the same time realize as an impossible task to finish, to complete, to the point that the history ends, history of Kant's interpretation in this case. So a text, well, how do we treat a text? We treat it as an interconnected set of propositions utilizing fixed concepts that have clear definitions. And these definitions are ideal in an ideal Kantian situation, unproblematic. They are comprehended equally by all reasonable beings, all readers. And thus the set of propositions is understood equally. And thus we arrive at the ideal of universal understanding. Well, the history of attempts to extract a conceptual system and finish the task of interpreting Kant with this has proven to be controversial. For instance, take early analytic attempts to read Kant, such as Peter Strawson's Bounds of Sense. His idea was, and he's explicit in the introduction, to take the critique, the first critique, and isolate it from all context, from other Kant's texts, from the thought of the 18th century, Germany or Prussia and Europe. Just take it as an expression of a set of propositions and concepts that stand the scrutiny on their own without the need to enrich or expand and thus relativize the understanding of Kant's thought. This approach has produced interesting and important, influential and fruitful results, but it hasn't been a decisive success. So we will not end with conceptual analysis, although we will have to do that. And well, my third talk, the day after tomorrow, will be dedicated to an attempt to place Kant's notion of enthusiasm more or less within the whole of his conceptual system. Well, this is only a second step. Then we need to address something that has become especially important in the later, or since the later part of the 20th century, after the linguistic turn, the context. And today it is obvious that an author makes a statement within a particular context, formed not only by his other works and expressions of thought or speech acts, but also by the discussions of the day. And the discussions that have been held before that, and so on. So, regarding Kant's actual condition, we'll see that his statements on history and enthusiasm are deeply connected to the, for instance, discussions that were held in Berlin among the enlighteners of Clara. And these discussions in turn are connected to the British and French attempts to develop science and education and ultimately social and political systems, structures that would surpass in their effectiveness the older ones. So we'll need to address that context as well. There are certain tools that allow us to work with the context, and I will briefly mention the classics of this approach, two schools that formed in Germany and in Great Britain, the Begriffsgeschichte, the history of concepts, and history of ideas of the Cambridge School. There are important similarities between the two approaches, important differences as well, but we'll look at them and, at a wider scale. What is common in these two and now classic approaches is that they treat philosophical expressions of philosophical thought as contextualized, well, in the case of Cambridge School speech acts. They're trying to use this Wittgensteinian, post-Wittgensteinian framework. And in the case of the German Begriffsgeschichte school, it's they approach the context via the study of definitions as expressed in the lexicons and vocabulary, Wörterbuche, and classical texts of the day. So the common approach, again, the commonality is that during the period of mid-18th, mid-19th century, roughly from the 1750 to 1850, and this is particularly stressed by the German school, the meanings of the words that are used, particularly in the discourse on history, are experiencing overwhelming transition. So there is a period of turbulence. On the one hand, at the entry point, there is largely scholastic and also Renaissance vocabulary and early modern, influenced by the in Europe by Christian thought that has been polishing the meanings of the words for centuries before that. And these meanings warp and twist and rearrange themselves throughout this century, the 100 years period of intellectual, social, political, economic, technological, etc., turbulence or change. So at the exit point, we see the meanings of the words, same words, radically varied. And Kant's critical period, his 2 decades of critical work, or less than that, or more, depending on how you count, is located right at the heart of this period. And he is a very important participant in this transition. An example, take the words subject and object. At the entry point, they have their scholastic meaning. An object is an intentional object in the thought. First of all, in the thought of the ultimate subject, of God. And the subject is a thing as it is, a thing in our ordinary sense. And then at the exit point, we see the opposite. Subject is the cognizing side, and the object is something that is cognized and exists objectively. The word objectivity becomes the uncritically taken coin, which we take for granted. But once we do this exercise in the history of ideas, we don't take it for granted anymore. And of course, we can stretch it further to the Aristotelian hyperkaimenon and antikaimenon, two words he uses in his corpus on the soul, for instance, to denote something that is, well, being cognized and resists cognition, something that is thrown against us, ourselves, the soul, psyche. So this small example illustrates the importance of Kant, who is the main force in shifting the meanings of the words and setting them on in their present positions. We use the words subject and object as Kant does. Well, so his innovation is fundamental. He's not the sole one. Of course, Descartes starts this relativization, but Kant finishes it and sets it in letter. Another example, more relevant to the, well, this one is also relevant, but this is even more relevant to the notion of history. Take the word humanity. We'll meet it once, time and again in the text of Kant's history. We see it in the second formula of the categorical imperative, always treat humanity, etc. Once you realize that, first of all, the word humanity is a translation. Second, that in German, Kant's Menschheit, and he has another word, Humanität, they are completely different concepts. Third, once you do the textual work and collect all the instances or tokens of Kant's use of the word Menschheit in his text and extract or take out definitions of this word, implied or explicit, you'll see that this word has different meanings. And there is an array of meanings that cannot be fully connected without tensions or contradictions. Well, for instance, he's speaking about Menschheit as a species. We'll see that in the text on history. And this brings us towards a holistic understanding of humanity as the joint subject of history, which Kant says is undergoing development or education by historical forces to develop the predispositions and so on. And individuals, Kant goes on, do not matter. And this strikes us as something that is, at least on the surface, in immediate contradiction to Kant's own second formula, always treat humanity in each person. And then there is this wording, humanity in the person, Humanität in der Person. And then you would try to understand what he means by that. What is a person? And then you encounter another wealth of interesting discoveries once you look into the evolution of the word prosopon that has went throughout Christianity, the initially meaning mask worn by an actor in the theater and something that is spoken through. So your true self is speaking through this device to be heard and understood. So basically a set of masks or social roles that you wear and that allow you to be heard, to be someone. And then throughout the Christian period it gets interiorized to become the essence of a human being, something that is an image and something that has to attain the likeness and so on. And then it becomes up to present point, the word that is a synonym to individuality, personality. We take it in a more naturalistic or maybe nominalistic sense without this prior depth. And we'll see in Kant that a person is intricately connected to morality. Personhood is how the extent to which you are receptive to the moral law and have the disposition or resolution, Gesinnung, to try to fulfill it. So and when we speak about history and the development of Menschheit throughout history, we cannot approach the subject without taking this exercise in the history of ideas and in recreating Kant's context up to the point of the origination of these words in ancient Greece, and even further perhaps. And of course Kant is Eurocentric, and reading Kant is necessarily Eurocentric too. Another, well, just two examples. I'll leave you with that. What we also can extract from this approach in the history of ideas, particularly from the Cambridge post-Wittgensteinian approach, that is that any speech act, a philosophical speech act, which is can be a statement or a text, an extended speech act, always has is again two sides. There is a speaker or writer with intentions, and we need to reconstruct the intentions of the speaker. And there is the recipient, the addressee, the reader, the audience, and we need to understand the audience and to understand what the writer understands about his or her audience and what he intends to do with the worldview of the audience, what beliefs he needs or intends to shift or shatter, replace, rearrange, etc. And this again puts us into an infinite circle, because the audience also has an idea about the author and his or her intentions, and those never overlap fully. When we look, if we want to become well obsessed or take this painstakingly, we can utilize contemporary argumentation theory or communication theory, pragma dialectics, or all the tools that have been developed to understand these communicative situations that we find ourselves in daily, and we can use to treat historical texts with. And once we do that, again, Kant's hope of providing us with an universal and unchangeable conceptual scheme becomes relativized. And that's the outcome. But this is not the only thing we need to address, the author's context. Linguistic turn has, with this intention or attention to context as speech acts and etc., has been taking place since the 50s. And then in the 70s it was augmented with a cultural turn, which means that we treat any position as emerging from a culture, not only a textual or propositional set of beliefs, but also from implicit and often unrealized beliefs, expectations, practices, and so on, communal structures. And Kant is also subject to this approach, particularly in the contemporary literature. And one of an important component of this transition is that we look at ourselves as interpreters using the same methods. We need to understand our own conceptual position, what set of beliefs we come from, what is our intention regarding Kant's text. And by the way, this is the topic of our first seminar. I thought that we should bring forth our own or contemporary clashes in the understanding of history, in the philosophy of history, and perhaps that could help us set the agenda for our own personal projects regarding Kant's philosophy. The question is, what do we want to get out of Kant to utilize in our contemporary discussions and efforts to understand ourselves, clarify our conceptual position, our presuppositions, our unexplicit beliefs, and so on. So we are also contextualized, and in our presentations, welcome speeches, we heard that. We are always situated, and the situation predisposes us to look for or to notice certain things and to dismiss other things, and including when reading Kant's text. And we need to, of course, make explicit effort to resist this tendency. And the only thing is the reflection, questioning yourself and trying to relativize your own unshakable beliefs. And perhaps that would result, well, there is a juncture there once after the fifth circle. Of course, as scholars, we embark on a new hermeneutic circle of understanding. We get a better grasp of the text. The green circle, it expands. We expand the set of texts that we rely upon. We start with Kant's idea of universal history and some explicitly historical texts, but then we understand that other texts are also relevant, and we end up in the Critique of Pure Reason and who knows where, in his lectures, in his written notes, and we see that's how academic careers develop. We see scholars who are immersed in notes and lectures nowadays after covering the pillars, the heights of Kant's critical texts, pre-critical as well. Well, that's one thing. You go on the new circle and on. And you produce your own text. I won't speak about that. It's a messy procedure. So that's how it goes. And that's how we will try to look at Kant's legacy. First, we will address the text. We'll try to extract the concepts. We'll try to see how they work or don't work in the system. The unproblematic bits, problematic bits. There are tensions. Enthusiasm is a deeply problematic notion or concept in Kant's philosophy. And then we'll try to expand on the context, and this is my main task. I will try to provide this context, of course, bits and pieces of it. It's impossible to do fully, just to give you a taste. And then we will, on the seminars, go on discussing our own conceptual positions and our contexts, and try to find if there is a common position and perhaps a common universal context in Kant's words that we find ourselves in and can rely upon to build understanding and trust. And this is the plan. There is another way to speak about methods in reading philosophical texts and constructing philosophical texts, and also about our present methodology of approaching Kant. And I'll use this, there is a pictorial term, so-called, in contemporary humanities. The basic is that we begin to think in pictures, images, visual culture, and so on. So this is an image for you. The philosophy as it was developed here in Kaliningrad by Professor Brushinkin, but I think it's a good tool to locate our well, again, tools or instruments for philosophical understanding. I'll start from well, philosophy has two hands. One is the square, logical, rational, but there is another one, the circular, the not so rational, and all are relevant in our task of understanding Kant, despite of whatever he might have thought about it. Kant is notoriously rationalistic, and we'll see that particularly in his philosophy of history, when he's, for example, criticizing Herder for relying too much on analogy and crossing the boundary neatly located here. There is a boundary. On the right side is proper philosophy. Concepts, propositions, inferences, that's the bread and butter. On the left side is the no-go territory for Kant. We'll see that it doesn't work that way. We'll have to address metaphors, narratives, imaginaries. We'll have to deal with images when speaking about history, because that's maybe again contrary to Kant's hopes, what sparks enthusiasm. we'll see that Kant believed that concepts spark enthusiasm, ideas as a subspecies of concepts. Ideas such as, well, kingdom of ends. But we can also treat this idea as an imaginary, as an image, as something that we do not really conceptualize, but rather visualize, to the extent that it is visualizable at all. And this, our ability to imagine, is something that connects our conceptual capacities, faculties, to the emotional faculties. Well, of course, if we start from the bottom, concepts is something that, well, the bottom is your basic logic textbook. You start with concepts, and there are operations. You define concepts. You divide the extensionals and do different operations with the concepts. Concepts fall into propositions, and different languages, or it was hoped so in the first half of the 20th century, express same propositions, and that what grants us universal understanding. This has been problematized since. And there are inferences, operations with propositions, and they're more precise. There are deductive inferences that provide us with the necessary truth of the conclusion, provided the premises are true. And there are non-deductive inferences, not as sound, but still invaluable. This is all familiar, I won't go through that. I wanted to end with analogy as the most or least precise of all non-deductive inferences. And particularly so in Kant. Once we look into his lectures on logic, be it Jena logic or Jesche logic, we'll see, or other, we'll see that he's not so, he's ambivalent, he's careful with analogy. He's not taking it to be a precise operation. An analogy, to remind you, is when you compare two things and you notice that there are similarities of properties, and then you infer that the property that you find in one thing should be existent in the other, because on the basis of the similarity of a set of other properties. So from analogy we cross into the non-logical side of metaphorical thinking or figurative thinking, because a metaphor is like an analogy, but you do not compare, you just infer that A is B, violating the laws of logic, but expanding your understanding nevertheless. And Kant, of course, would not have supported this approach. But notice, once we begin to read or search Kant's text for metaphors, we'll find them. Well, there is for instance, there are studies of legal metaphors in the Critique of Pure Reason, Court of Reason, and so on. So Kant is basically if we, so to speak, overextend this claim beyond defensible, Kant is basing the critical investigation on the court procedure. He's envisioning it as a trial, yes, and that informs his conceptual building. The architectonics that he's suggesting us in the critique. Of course, this is questionable, but to an extent defensible approach. Or if we look into his philosophy of history, well, I will save it for later. So we should look for metaphors, not only for concepts, propositions, inferences, arguments, but also for breaks when Kant is, so to speak, betraying himself and using the ordinary speech, which is full of metaphors. And of course, there is a methodology for studying metaphors. I spoke about the history of ideas. There is a history of metaphors as well, and there is a view that, well, Nietzsche is the famous proponent. Every concept is a X metaphor. our concepts enter our discourse or thought as poetic findings. Someone grasps and offers it, and then it undergoes Nietzsche in his essay on truth and lie in a non-moral sense. He's using a metaphor of a coin, which a metaphor is a coin that undergoes rubbing and use and changes its face and becomes an unproblematic thing. We don't notice it. Whereas as numismats, we can find something interesting in every concept, its metaphorical past. And more recently, Hans Blumenberg has developed a metaphorology that basically says there are absolute metaphors underlying our thinking about history particularly. And these are like tectonic platforms that basically form epochs. And once our metaphorical grasp of an epoch shifts, that means that we're in a new era. And concepts are built up atop. So the most basic foundation is metaphorical. We'll need to be sensitive to that once we read Kant's text. Perhaps, again, fully contrary, Kant is the seemingly least acceptable author to this approach. Well, maybe there are also analytic philosophers, but they have their own metaphors. Oh, Yana Antonovna ended her speech with the idea that we should pursue light. Isn't it a metaphor for truth throughout the human history, from Plato and even beyond? And in non-Western cultures as well. So all for metaphors. Then there are narratives. There are stories that are contrasted to conceptual systems. Conceptual systems and facts, they are organizing a claim that they're true. Narratives do not necessarily claim they are fictional narratives, but they create meaning. I will not go into that in greater detail, but there is a narrative turn in the humanities from at least the 80s. There are ideas that our selves are narrative, episodic or comprehensive. Still, stories make meaning. This is the domain where the meaning is born, again, metaphorically and then conceptualized. Then there are imaginaries, again, as a tool of trade that has been, we can trace it, well, to Kant. Obviously, there is productive and reproductive imagination in Kant, and his conception has been very influential. But more recently, people like Sartre developed in the phenomenological perspective the theories of imagination as a capacity to grasp something fully. Discursive reasoning a la Descartes from one clear and distinct idea to the other proofs, they do not allow to comprehend the whole. Imaginaries and imagination allow us to a preliminary grasp of the whole, which we then can try to conceptualize. So, when we speak about history, we're trying to grasp the whole, and therefore, imaginative thinking is inevitable. We are trying to grasp the beginning of times, and we'll see Kant does so in his conjectural beginning of human history, to the end of times, the end of all things. He has a treatise on that as well. And this is only done through imagination, at least tentatively. Then we begin to conceptualize. So, more recently, after Sartre, there is a great line of thought that starts perhaps with Cornelius Castoriadis, who, in his book on imaginary institution of society. And then there is Benedict Anderson with imaginary communities that rely on this capacity of imagination in explaining how humans bond together in large groups, such as nations, or we can say a public. Kant is imagining, he said, receipt, going back to the idea of contextual analysis, as the public. He's speaking about the public enlightening itself and so on. What is the public, we might ask? And the answer would be an imaginary community of literate burghers, people like Kant who live across national borders. It's an anachronism to speak of national borders in the Kant's times. So beyond Prussia, there are these Baltic towns like Riga or Lübeck, to which post-Hanseatic, to which Kant and his near circle like Behrens and Hamann, Herder have connections. And he's envisioning a community of literate people, and there are, of course, merchants from other places like Joseph Green, Kant's closest friend from Hull in England. And he's thinking of the public as this enlightened bourgeois community, or Bürger community, Weltbürger, his wording. And this is a very interesting entity. We like to think of Kant as a cosmopolitan, and we're looking for a sense of what it means to be a cosmopolitan in Kantian sense. Well, this is an important addition to our quest, an imagined community of literate non-aristocrats, town dwellers, etc., etc. So it's highly relevant in understanding Kant's intentions, particularly in writings about history. And we will need to utilize all of those tools. Some are obvious concepts, propositions, inferences, conceptual structures in Kant's text, but we also need to look into narratives, imaginaries, and metaphors. And I will leave images aside. Well, we may say, again, a general idea about Kant's view of history. As I mentioned, he thought that we get motivated by concepts, by ideas. We experience emotions when we enthusiasm, when we think about the ends of humanity and purposes of nature. But so we can say that for Kant, the direction of development of thought goes from the right to the top and then doesn't cross to the left. There are concepts, ideas, they're a priori, meaning ahistorical, they're pure, not affected by the development of nature. They are somehow atemporal. They pre-exist, at least they predate our particular experience. And then we develop our thought to the left, and some of us cross into the metaphorical, figurative domain. And Kant pinpoints some of his former friends like Hamann as enthusiasts or Schwärmer, fanatics, people who use wrong tools to comprehend the world and express their thoughts about it. So I thought it very important to place Hamann against Kant as an addition to Kantian rationalism, Hamannian irrationalism, and he had a lot to say about history too, to complete this set of tools that we have at our disposal. Particularly, it is interesting that they both lived in Königsberg and basically were neighbors and for a time friends and were respectful enemies, philosophical enemies, or opponents rather, thereafter. So for Kant, the left side is basically a Hamannian side that is a wrong enthusiasm, enthusiastic thinking in the extreme, fanaticism. Schwärmer meaning literally, Schwärmerei is when you, first of all, it's a religious thought, and second, it takes non-existent things as existent. Something that is written in the scripture is taken to be a literal event of history, or something experienced as a mystical arousal, emotional arousal, is taken to be the centerpiece of experience, like Hamann experienced in London when he was in his early days and became a Christian devout. Well, again, this is an important dimension of enthusiasm for Kant. We'll look into that later. Some enthusiasm is wrong, and that wrong enthusiasm deals with metaphors, narratives, and imaginaries. So, what about history? How this is a diachronical, a cut section, or synchronical, how the development might look like. We can visualize this historical movement, for instance, like this. We can say that for Kant, the driving force of history are the concepts, propositions, inferences. And they propel our energies, they motivate us to develop human potential, predispositions to humanity throughout history. But there is another view that says that the driving force is on the left, the images, the narratives, metaphors, and so on. And they get conceptualized and become inferences afterwards through our rational efforts. So the priority lies on the left, and the theory kicks in later. Well, what is history? We can say, again, etymologically or historically. We'll look into the meaning of the word and find that histor is a wise man, a judge, someone who is experienced and has a sound judgment, another important capacity that Kant had a lot to say about. And is also that man, well, in Platonic sense, is capable of governing. He's literally a helmsman, Kubernetes. So on a Kantian and Platonic account of history, they're probably in the vicinity here, Kant and Plato. And some who say that Kant is a Platonist probably partly mean that history starts with the concepts that set things in motion while themselves being immovable, the ideas. And then history is full of metaphors, narratives, imaginaries, sound and fury, which is reducible to concepts and should be reduced. Or we could say that so there is this glorious view of history as a navigation to an end which is understood, or at least grasped by the wise man, by the histor. And that histor needs to gain power to steer the boat towards this final end, regardless of the opinions of the crew, who are not so well informed and so on. But perhaps this is an overly optimistic in its evaluation of human capacities, view of history. Perhaps we're in a different process of spontaneous development of natural forces, and that comprehension that ideas inform our understanding and drive history, and we get enthusiastic about ideas, is somewhat epiphenomenal, whereas we're immersed into a process that is hard to understand. Well, with this it is a question. I wanted to problematize our future endeavors. We'll try to discern both trends in Kant, whether it's a spontaneous and ungoverned process, or it is a human-led or nature-led, reason-led process that we are capable of comprehending and steering. All right, this is an appetizer, some thoughts about methods, tools of trade, approaches, some Kant's ideas, and now I would like to hear your questions. If any. Well, it's a good start. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. The weather is benevolent to our efforts to understand Kant and not get distracted by the town or the beach, so we can concentrate. All right, thank you very much.
Vadim?
Yes.
Perhaps you could comment a bit. For me, for example, the concept of perspective would be relevant here. We should, we kind of start problematizing that. If you have a perspective, it means that there is another point of view.
Yes.
So if this Kant was sent to speak about a point of view, it would kind of be outside. But one of the consequences of Kant's transcendentalism is that your concepts and your principles are my concepts and my principles. So how is it possible to speak about a perspective according to Kant and critical philosophy if there is actually no way to depart from our principles, from our concepts? This is universal. This is also supposed to be universal. This is my mind works as your mind. So how we can make place in Kant's transcendental philosophy to speak about a perspective? I think one of the consequences is that we can only look one way. So how can we go out of this transcendental scheme and critical philosophy and speak meaningfully about a person?
Thanks very much. Well, it brings us towards epistemology and contemporary efforts to develop a perspectival program in epistemology, which is has been the thing, or among other the things, in recent maybe a decade or so. And the idea of a perspectivist program is to offer an alternative to realism and anti-realism in epistemology, meaning that realists believe that there is an outside world and we only get to know anything insofar as the knowledge is about something that exists independently of our knowing, etc. And anti-realists say that no, it's our efforts to cognize that bring about the formation of the project or constitution of the project in Kantian terms. And both, interestingly, attempt to trace their legacy from Kant. Especially it is so with the anti-realists who claim basically that Kant's Kant's idea that the subject has a scheme that constructs an object, particularly if we lean towards 50, then the transcendentalism actually is the early version of anti-realism. And of course there are different domains that are more or less susceptible to this approach. For instance, in physics we'll find more realists, because, well, the belief that there is hard reality out there is just so basic to this whole area of study. Whereas in the social sciences and humanities we tend to find anti-realists. And the science wars of the late 80s, 90s that are more or less dormant now have shown the extent of the controversy between these two approaches. And perspectivism is trying to claim that both sides have something to offer, and one side is right in saying that there is something, a thing in itself, in Kantian terms, and the other side is correct, or anti-realist side is correct in claiming that we make a thing out of something, undefined something, due to our capacities, not as Kant thought, a priori universal, but evolution dependent and culturally influenced and so on. Therefore, each perspective is, whereas few would argue that there are common things, basic things, we think in terms of space and time and order. We differentiate between the outside and the inside. There are basic foundations or dimensions to our experience and knowledge. But once we depart from the basics, we differentiate. And this differentiation has decisive influence on the whole. Therefore, we cannot speak of a universal perspective that we all share as bearers of transcendental subject. We need to speak about multiple perspectives, multiple positions, different horizons, and then this whole phenomenological vocabulary of horizons and life worlds kicks in. And we need, if we further relativize it, the cultural studies provide the meta framework for physics in the extreme instance, as well as for other attempts. To the extent then say, well, we could attack or try to understand Kant's idea that space and time are inner forms of sensibility in terms of his effort to combat the absolutist tendencies of Newtonian mechanics and to carve space and time for himself as the bearer, owner of this basic capacities of organizing experience. So, well, I'm pushing it a bit, but this approach is all pervasive. So, turning back to perspective, even though we may think that the logic is the same, the right side of the spectrum that I have here is the same, the form, the content, in Kant's terms, intuitions are different. And a perspective is formed by, as in Aristotle, by the unity of the two. It's not only concepts or structures that perspectivize or positionize or place, territorialize, etc. ourselves. It's also the content, the matter, and they're inseparable. So once we have these unities, we end up with a difference in perspectives, in positions. And this is, again, Kant would have not, it's highly contestable, of course. It's just one program. My idea in bringing it to the fore was that we are all entitled to have different perspectives on Kant. And the interesting thing is to try and come up with the with the overlaps, as well as to explicate the differences.
Just to comment about that, I was thinking about metaphors, narratives. Would you say that they could be constitutive of Kantian thought in different subjects, or are they just helping illustrating how we build concepts and propositions? Because to me they are, in general at least, more like complementary, not constitutive. But in the case of aesthetics, for example, especially on the third critique, when Kant is talking about the beauty, this concept of beauty, he says that it's a feeling of pleasure derived from the free play between imagination and understanding. So in this case, in this specific case, we are not talking about concepts in the beauty. So I think it would be an example how to integrate this.
Indeed. He also thinks or mentions, I think it's the third critique, where he says that there is no knowledge without the basic feeling. And feeling is necessarily individualized. It's something that is subjective, and I will deal with it in the third installment or part of my talk the day after tomorrow. Feelings are necessary, and they are the source, the moving source of our cognition. So that also instantiates us, separates us from each other. And also, if we look from the other side, about narratives in Kant's philosophy, if we look at the history of his development of thinking about history, we find that he starts with a story of the development of heavens, how the planets came to be. And it's not a theory, it's a story. It's not, there are no observations or attempts to derive general laws. He only mentions gravity. He's relying on Newton, of course, in this approach. But he's telling a story, and this is a comprehensive story of everything from the start, from the creation of matter to, well, he doesn't end anywhere in that particular text, but does elsewhere. So we could say that his whole philosophy is framed by a narrative. Of course, we may continue by saying that his true achievement is the conceptual scheme, and this is just a story about the emergence. We can study Genesis, but it's not the content of Kant's thought. Its emergence is secondary, auxiliary. Well, we could say otherwise. If the story of emergence would be different, then the result would be different. Could have been, perhaps. So it's again another controversial set of views, or a pair of views, and there are combinations. It's a spectrum. Yes. Well, regarding our seminars then, we'll start, as I mentioned today, with a discussion of two recent and highly competitive, maybe two rather radical texts about the history today. And then we'll continue to read, to look into Herder and Kant's as a counterpoint to Kant. Because Kant's critical treatises on history were to an extent a reaction to earlier efforts of Herder and Hamann to offer their explanations of history. Herder was also long in developing his text, and Kant had first-hand or second-hand from Hamann information about Herder's ideas before the publication of the first book. And he reviewed the first two books of Herder's ideas. So it's an important counterpoint, particularly to the use of analogy and metaphors. Herder embraces this method. He thinks that that's the only way we can approach history. Kant is, his most number one criticism of Herder. You're using the wrong methods. What is it? Fiction, poetry, literature, rhetorics. It's not the way to do philosophy. And this methodological clash is as vivid as ever. And then we'll finally go on to read Kant's texts, first on enthusiasm. And here we'll look into anthropology and his theory of feelings. And we'll try to place enthusiasm among Kant's taxonomy of feelings and see how it works, or maybe doesn't. And then we'll look into, at the end, Kant's texts on history proper. First, early critical texts before the French Revolution and before the change of climate in Prussia, when Frederick II, or the Great, the old Fritz, was still in power. The climate was one thing, and then his successor altered things a lot, and there was a great degree of expectation of what might come in the mid-80s. Frederick died in 86. Might come about for the intellectuals, and Kant was deeply concerned, and some of his treatises on history are again located within this climate. And then the French Revolution altered his views and altered the public attitudes, led to the change of context, and we'll see how that resulted in the change of texts and concepts. In the final and fifth seminar, where we'll look into the conflict of the faculties. So that's the plan for our reading. The reader is quite voluminous, but we'll do as good as we possibly can. Okay, that's the plan.
Well, you know that the title of my scientific work is totally connected to history, especially in Kant's history, and I'm still puzzled how to talk about history in Kant's philosophy. I mean, is it Geschichte or history? Because you just mentioned that when we're talking about what's history, and you cited the ancient word Eastern, but it's connected to history. In Kant's philosophy, it's still Geschichte, and it has another root. And how does this fit? How would it be correct to talk about Geschichte in Kant's philosophy?
That's a fascinating question that we'll need to address in more details, perhaps relying on your knowledge. Your application was, your text was very interesting, in that respect, and it's an exercise in the history of ideas, words, concepts. Well, Kant uses Geschichte. There is history now and then in his corpus. So he uses both words, and we need to understand why would he differentiate. If it's understandable, it could be the case that it's unreflective. Just read one text and use the word from that text. Or could be otherwise. So the discussions about history in the Kant surroundings, in Kant's context, in Prussian context, started with, again, there were at least two primary sources. One was the outside, and that's the thoughts of particularly Voltaire. His history was the inspiration for the German efforts to do the same or better. So that's one source of the word from the French discussions. Also, the British were influential, particularly via the popular philosophy. British historical political discussions were quite influential among the people like Christian Garve were the proponents of that type of philosophizing through essays and by addressing the public rather than building conceptual systems. And perhaps, that's my hypothesis, the English word history also contributed to the use of the word history. But Geschichte, I have no ready explanation for the preference for this word in Kant's text. But that's one source, the outside, the French and the English largely, not even, well, the Scottish too. Hume had a lot to say about history as well, for instance. the British then. So the other was the internal discussion about the destination of humanity. And I will talk about it in the section about the context of Kant thought. I'll only say that the quest for the reinterpretation of biblical story was very acute in the mid-17th century, or 18th rather, sorry. And with people like Spalding writing about the meaning or the destination, Bestimmung of humanity, Menschheit, in terms of, well, biblical education and enlightenment, Christian, within the Christian framework. And then it gradually drifted from the theological perspective, it got secularized. And by Kant's time, we see in Kant's ideas, of course, when he speaks about nature as having plans, it's the remnants of this theological system or thinking, or at least it could be understood that way. Whereas the bulk is the naturalistic development inspired by Newton and his early interest in natural philosophy. So why Geschichte? We'll have to look into that, and perhaps you could tell us.
Oh, that was something because you just mentioned that our primary sources is French discussion, British discussion. Unfortunately, you couldn't tell something about German discussion, and it's my idea to discover something new.
For let's say a novice or a beginner, for a beginner to, let's say, Kant, I'm keen to know if you suggest something, a book or something which gives me what was happening around this time in the region he was there. Like if there is local record, even for the global events, but it should be from the region where he was living, like this region or something. Yes.
Well, the first book to look into is Kant's biography by Manfred Kuhn, and also his earlier biographies by his contemporaries, of a younger generation. So, and there is also a collection of memoirs about Kant gathered or prepared in the early 18th century, 19th century, sorry, I keep confusing centuries. That's the primary sources. Regarding wider history, there are several excellent German histories of Königsberg and East Prussia of a more recent, and some are mid-century, some are rather recent. And I could give you, I'll have to look to find the precise titles, and I'll supply you with that.
Like you said his friend Joseph, right? His friend, Kant's friend.
Yes, Joseph Green.
Yeah, Joseph Green. Is there any thing written by him, or there is some conversation? No, nothing.
No, he was highly literate, and he was basically influenced by the scientific and philosophical developments of the day. For instance, he is the one probably, well, he started following the clock before Kant did, so Kant probably picked up the habit from him of being punctual and so on. And for Green, it was a way to overcome the mechanism of nature. He was familiar with the details of mechanistic worldview. So, but he wasn't a writer, he was a merchant. And although Kant later wrote that I've discussed every single passage of the critique with him, we don't know the details, and probably never will.
Or maybe it is already incorporated in his writings in some form.
Yeah, but it's chaotic. You probably cannot extract from. It goes one way.